welcome back to 500 Hobbies. My name is Amanda, and I am a serial hobbyist based out of the United States, trying 500 hobbies to find my perfect fun fact. So, today, following up on my fall and winter knitting plans, we are going to be winding up some yarn using the Yarn Swift and the yarn winder back there, and we're going to swatch up for the projects that I mentioned. But first, I want to talk about what I'm wearing today. This is the Goji sweater by Taro Knits. This was also an earlier sweater in my knitting journey. It's knit up with knitting for olive merino and knitting for olive soft silk mohair, which I think is really classic, nice combo. This is a drop shoulder construction and one of the only sweaters I've done that requires a lot of seaming. And it's nothing against the pattern. I just don't think that it's a strong suit of mine. So you do the front and the back knit flat, and then you seam these up and along the side. And I think the pattern has you do the sleeves knit flat as well, but I ended up just joining in the round and knitting the sleeves in the round as you would for kind of like a top-down construction. It features this balloon sleeve detail, which I think is really comfy and kind of oversized. I wear it for work, or if we're just kind of like cozying around the house. I think balloon sleeves maybe not for everybody, and actually I made them a little bit smaller than in the pattern. The pattern is really, really oversized, which I think is some people's desired fit. If I did it again, I might taper these sleeves down a little bit more because while they look really cool, they do kind of get in the way when I'm doing everyday things. But yeah, this is another knit that I wear a lot and I'm super happy with. So on to our tasks for today. We are going to be winding up one hank each of the yarns that came for my fall and winter knitting projects in hanks. So first we have Playful Day Yarns. This is a 70% superwash merino and 20% yak, 10% nylon yarn in the color Mother Fern. And this is going to go to my slipover vest kind of situation. Right now I'm thinking about the Vest Barcelona by Mochi Knits, but I know the yarn weight is a little bit off. So swatching will help us kind of figure that out. And then the other one I have is a Knit Picks yarn. This is Muse Aran Weight in the color Focus Tonal. This is 100% superwash merino wool, which basically just means you can pop it in the washing machine and the dryer on low. So you'll notice I just have one skein of each that I'm going to be, or one hank of each that I'm going to be winding up today. Basically, I've read, and I'm sure other people are, more expert in this area than me. I've read that when you cake up the yarn, it kind of stresses the yarn a bit out a bit. So it's recommended that you only wind it up kind of like right before you're about to cast on. So since I'm planning on just swatching these for now, and we'll cast on probably later in the year, I'm just going to wind up one of each so I can work with it easier to make the swatch, not stress out every skein that I have. And I will talk a little bit about the tools that I'll be using today. So I have the Stanwood yarn winder and also the matching Yarn Swift. In general, I think whether getting these kinds of tools depends on the kinds of yarn you're working with most often and how often you're working with yarn in general. I think knitting, like a lot of hobbies, as I've learned, you can spend a lot of money on tools to make the craft easier. I don't know if those are necessary or essential. I don't think they're necessary or essential. So how the hank works basically is it comes like this, and then you unwind it like that. And it has like little bits of yarn that keep it together in this loop shape. And so when you use the Swift, you just like put it over top and then it holds the yarn while you wind it. Before I invested in these tools, I just put this over the back of a chair, or if you're sitting, you can kind of put it like across your knees, and then just wind the ball by hand. And I think that works just as well. However, I will say if you are winding, sweater quantities of these hanks pretty often, you're probably going to want to invest in these because it is very time consuming to do it by hand that way. And for me, that is like my least favorite part, kind of like preparing for the knitting. I want to get to the knitting itself, right? I'll also say if you are buying from local yarn shops, which I do try and do, especially when I'm traveling, instead of ordering hanks online, which I also end up doing a fair amount. The local yarn shops typically have these yarn swifts and the winders, and they will offer to wind it up for you right there and then. However, as I mentioned, you really only want to do that right before you're casting on. So, if you're buying souvenir yarn, like I often do, when we're traveling to a new place, that's probably not what you want to be doing. In terms of price, the Stanwood stuff is, to my knowledge, the most expensive stuff you can get. And so I was working without these tools for a while. And then when I decided to buy them, I thought I'll just get like the very best ones because I know I'm going to use it over a long period of time. And I have. I bought these about 3 or 4 years ago. So maybe there's something better or more expensive on the market now. If you're looking for kind of a smaller investment, so the Stanwood yarn winder was $80 when I bought it, and the Swift was $50. If you're looking for like a lower budget option, I think they sell them also at your Michaels or your Knit Picks. And so if you're not sure if you want to spend $80 or $50 on these tools, I think there are more budget friendly options. I don't own any of those, so I can't really speak to the difference between using a Stanwood and using a Michaels tool. But I understand it's just like not in the budget for some people, or it's just not how much you want to invest in a hobby like this. So those are options as well. Since I bought these, I also have come to learn that they have electric yarn winders. So you'll see me kind of like cranking the yarn winder for a while. Apparently there are electric ones that do that for you now too, so maybe that's something that you could look into as well. I am kind of interested in that, but again, I spent a lot of money on these tools, so I don't think I'll be able to justify buying a new yarn winder until this one breaks, and according to Stanwood, should not pretty much never break. So I guess that's just something I will look at in the store. Okay, so now that we've kind of done a little intro to the yarn winding, let's get going. So now that we have our 2 yarn cakes, I'm going to work on swatching them up. Hello. So it has been a couple days now, and I have successfully swatched on all 4 yarns that I need for my fall and winter knitting plans. I have never really swatched everything for a season in 1 week before, and I thought that was actually a really fun way to get through what I consider kind of the more boring prep work for a project I usually just want to cast on, and that's why for a while, I was not doing gauge swatches at all. But after a few items kind of were either way too big or way too small, I've learned my lesson, and now I do gauge swatch all my projects. And I keep them in a little box. And actually, I think that is kind of nice to have like a tiny little memento from every project I've worked, even if that memento ends up going to someone as a gift knit or something like that. So if you have never gauge swatched before, I'll talk a little bit about it. Basically, every pattern will provide you with some instructions showing how many stitches and how many rows it should take with the recommended yarn to get a square of about 4 inches by 4 inches or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. When you're doing the gauge swatch, I usually tack on a couple extra stitches and a couple extra rows just to make sure your edge stitches, which do act a little bit different, especially in textured knits, than your regular stitches, to make sure that those don't affect your measurement. And I've seen some people make like really big swatches, which maybe is the best practice. But I try and do pretty much the least amount of swatching as possible. And I think it works out most of the time these days. So I will go through each of these one by one. I'll start with the yarn for the clematis sweater that we wound up the other day. So you can see this is the Muse Aran yarn in Focus Tonal, and also the mohair from my stash that I thrifted a long time ago. And I think it works out pretty nicely. A pretty good color match. I think this will be pretty unique compared to everything else I have in my closet, so I'm pretty pleased with that. For this gauge swatch, we were hoping for 14 stitches by 23 rows. I ended up with 13.5 stitches by 19 rows, which to me, and maybe I would be unique in a group of knitters, but I think that's close enough probably. I'm thinking that mostly because I know the clematis is an oversized fit, and the issue with this combination is really with the number of rows rather than the number of stitches. And you can always add more length if you need to. And since this is for me, I'll be able to try it on as we go to make sure it's the length that I want. So I think I'm probably going to stick with this for now, and I'm excited to cast that on. Second, the other yarn we wound up was this yak yarn by Playful Day Yarns. And I know we had talked about the Best Barcelona being that goal project for this yarn, but I took another look at that pattern and I realized there was just no way that this yarn was going to match gauge, and I was going to either have to knit a bigger size or a different size. And I just did not trust myself to do that kind of math. So I ended up going and looking for a different Mochi Knits pattern, and that was the Best Claire, which actually I think fits the vibe of what I was looking for a lot better. I don't know why I didn't come across this pattern before. And it's also made for a fingering weight yarn. So I think, you know, all the stars aligned on this project. Using the recommended needle size, we were looking for 25 stitches by 37 rows. I ended up with 23 stitches by 33 rows, which I think is probably a little bit too small. So right before I cast this project on, I'm going to try swatching again with a needle size that's just one size up. And I think that will probably work. Right now the fabric is pretty tight. You can kind of see some holes, but I think it could stand to go up one more needle size without it being super gappy. My other option that I thought about, which was the kind of my first impression to do, was to hold this double with a mohair or something, but I really want to work with this yarn alone just because it's so nice. And when I work with these indie dyer yarns from local yarn shops, I think you want to let this yarn shine and not put it with the mohair, which I think would probably kind of overshadow it. So stay tuned on this one, but excited to cast that on as well. Now I have two more that I didn't need to wind up. So first we have my swatch for the Ingrid sweater. And I think when you're doing a textured knit, especially, these swatches become really important. So I was able to kind of get a flavor for each of the textures that you have to do as part of the Ingrid sweater. And I think it's a really good opportunity for you to practice that and make sure you understand the charts. When you're working with a garment that's maybe over 100 stitches, that is not the first time that you want to be working with those textures. Because if you make a mistake, you're going to have to rip back. It's just more work. You know, this is a case where the gauge swatch, I think, is especially going to save you time and gives you time to learn. This, we were looking for 20 stitches by 28 rows. And I think probably for the first time ever, I was able to match the gauge swatch exactly. So I'm probably going to cast this on in the next week or so. This will be my first one, mostly because it's a gift knit and it's a men's sweater. So it's going to take me a really long time. And I want to make sure that I reach the finish line at the deadline for this one. And then finally, we have the yarn for the olive cardigan. I actually did 2 gauge swatches for this. The first one I did, it was really exciting to kind of see that feather olive motif come together from the chart. I worked it with the recommended needle size, which was 6.5 millimeters. I could tell as I was working on it that this probably was not going to work out. You can see that it's a little bit gappier than I would want for a cardigan, thinking about wearing it. And when I did my measurements, it was way too big. So I decided to do a second gauge swatch down to 5.5. You can see that already like looks a lot better in my mind when you're thinking about wearing it. It's still a little airy, but I think at the acceptable amount. You want it to be kind of a light cardigan, but not totally gappy. So we were looking for 17 stitches by 24 rows, and we have about that using the 5.5 millimeter needles. So I think that's a really good example of how important the gauge swatch is. If I had just gone with the recommended for that, I would probably end up with a fabric that I'm not super happy with, and also one that is probably way too big based on the size that I'm knitting. So those are my 4. I thought it was really fun to do all these swatches in a row and kind of get a flavor for each of my future works in progress, and I'm excited to cast on. So that's all we're going to talk about today, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks so much for tuning in.